Joseph is a former federal prosecutor and FBI consultant, and Joseph joins me from Washington. Good evening to you.
Hi, Carol. Good to be with you.
Joseph, the special counsel says it is not clear if Donald Trump did commit obstruction of justice based on their findings. No charges were laid. Can anything be done to get to the bottom of whether he did or did not commit obstruction?
Sure, Carol. And we who have been watching this closely have wondered for the past 3 weeks, why didn't Bob Mueller take a stand on the obstruction portion of his investigation? It sounded like he was grappling with different issues of law and fact, and therefore could not really come up with a conclusion. Now that I've had a few hours to digest the report in its redacted form, I don't think that's quite right. I think that what he said at the outset was, look, you can't charge a sitting president, so I'm not going to come up to the conclusion as to whether or not the president was guilty of obstruction of justice. I'm open to exonerating him, but I can't do that either because there is considerable evidence here. So to your question, I think this is headed to Congress, whether Bob Mueller intended that or not. That is the body that's appropriate to get this information, basically take the fact-finding that Bob Mueller and his team did for the past 2 years, and then decide, does this rise to the level of an impeachable offense?
Yeah, it's interesting you say we don't know whether it was his intention or not, but he left a pretty big hint in this report pointing out that Congress has the authority to determine whether president obstructed justice.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and you're right. It was not explicit, but it was certainly in there for all of us to see. I mean, remember, Congress could have done this investigation itself, right? Instead, we have sort of this hybrid. We have this sort of Justice Department executive branch investigation that's saying, well, we'll gather facts, but we're not going to really come to a conclusion because we can't. Our hands are tied. So now Congress is saying, I'm going to reach in there, grab this information from the executive branch, whether it's voluntary or via subpoena, and then we'll decide what to do with it. So clearly, whether that was the intended conclusion or not, that's definitely where this is going.
Joseph, what are the damning pieces of evidence that point to an obstruction allegation?
Well, certainly the special counsel's team did grapple, and they point to several legal and factual issues as to whether or not there's an obstruction case could be brought, putting even aside the policy implications of whether you can indict a sitting president. But I think you do have this series of events that the president conducted, some in public and some in private, where it certainly looks like he was intent on either slowing down or stopping altogether the Russia probe. Now we can sort of surmise as to why he did this, whether he was simply frustrated at this process or if he had something that was more of a corrupt intent. But the fact is, it's not one, it's not two, it's up to 10 different instances over the course of a period of time that people are saying, look, one time maybe could be excused, but there's a pattern here of both public and private behavior, and we have to determine whether or not the intent ultimately was to stop the investigation before it could be completed.
Yeah, that's the tricky part. And most people would point to the fact that he wanted Mueller fired and gave the order to do so as proof that he was trying to interfere and shut down this investigation. Is that necessarily so?
Well, you can certainly have an attempted obstruction of justice, right? You don't necessarily have to be successful in obstructing justice, simply trying to do that, simply trying to stymie a lawful investigation, which this was. That's enough to say you took efforts to obstruct the justice system. That's a crime in itself, whether or not it ultimately was successful. So yes, it certainly is something that Congress can run with, and certainly is something that, even though the special counsel opted not to make a recommendation, doesn't mean Congress won't.
Okay, Trump is saying this report clears his name, that he was found to have not been guilty of any wrongdoing. Take a listen to what he said earlier today.
No collusion, no obstruction. There never was, by the way, and there never will be. And we do have to get to the bottom of these things, I will say. But I say it in front of my friends, this should never happen to another president again. This hoax, this should never happen to another president again.
All right. What about the idea that it was a hoax, first of all, and that this report vindicates him? What would you say?
Well, I mean, first off, there's the fact that even though no charges right now are being brought against the president, the fact remains there are a number of individuals and companies, both in this country and in Russia, that are now under prosecution or sitting in jail as a result of the special counsel probe. So to say it was just a hoax and there was nothing to it, I think is inaccurate. Now, as far as what happens to the president, I think as far as collusion, that's probably the end of the line. I mean, Congress can and should keep pushing into Russia's efforts to interfere with the election, to make sure it doesn't happen again, to find out what exactly was done, to pursue possibly future prosecutions of these individuals who remain outside the reach of the Justice Department, but that's probably it as far as the president and his family. With respect to obstruction, though, I think it is far too early to take this sort of victory lap, because he was not exonerated. The special counsel had the opportunity, and he said it, I am open to exonerating him, but I can't because there is significant evidence here. So the president may have a good day in his mind. However, that is not to say he is out of the woods.
Okay, he also said that there is a need to get to the bottom of these things so that this never happens to another president again. What, if anything, could he do now to prevent any future investigations such as this one from happening?
Well, there's two ways to take that comment. One is to say we should get to the bottom of the genesis of this Russia probe, and that's already happening, right? The Inspector General at the Justice Department, federal prosecutors, now the Attorney General are all looking into how this began. Maybe it was legitimate, maybe not, but they're going to get to the bottom of it, I'm confident, and I frankly doubt there was anything nefarious here. On the second part, though, is if the president hopes to inoculate himself from any kind of future investigation, I'm not sure how he's going to accomplish that. I mean, in this country, we are very adamant that we police ourselves, both within the executive branch and with respect to Congress. It is one of Congress's core constitutional functions to conduct oversight. So comments like that are not particularly helpful. We want a system of checks and balances. We want vigorous oversight. And the idea that a president can say, just because this investigation didn't bear fruit against him personally, means it should never happen again, is really, frankly, not well-founded.
All right. Joseph, I want you to listen to what the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, Adam Schiff, had to say today in reference to the Attorney General, William Barr. Very strong criticism. Take a listen.
The Attorney General is not the president's personal lawyer, although he may feel he is. He is supposed to be the highest law enforcement officer in the land, and he is supposed to represent the interests of the American people. But when the Attorney General gives the perception that the President fully cooperated in the investigation when he didn't, that they provided all the information materials when they didn't, when the President, in fact, deprived the Special Counsel of perhaps the single most important piece of evidence, that is his own verbal testimony, that misleads the American people.
Yeah, Schiff saying that the Attorney General did a grave disservice to the United States of America by misrepresenting, mischaracterizing what was in the report. Is he correct?
Well, the Attorney General obviously had to make some significant decisions these past few weeks, and certainly today, as to how he was going to handle this situation. He could have taken an extremely light touch. He could have taken the report, redacted what he felt he needed to, and handed it to the public and to Congress without any comment. On the other end of the spectrum, he could weigh in on exactly the issue the special counsel opted not to weigh in on, which was obstruction of justice. And he felt obviously no impediment to doing so. He weighed in a matter of just 48 hours and said, I don't find obstruction of justice here, and I'm making that determination on the merits, not because of some procedural implications here. So he's going to get criticism no matter what he does. Unfortunately, he has opened himself up to some criticism that he's not the impartial attorney for the American people. He has a partisan slant. Now, whether that's fair or unfair, the fact is that criticism is now there. And I think the end result, sadly, is that it's going to be a continued lack of confidence by the American people in our institutions. And that's really the victim here.
All right. Joseph Moreno, former federal prosecutor and FBI consultant. Joseph, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Excellent interview. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. My pleasure.